Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, great to have your company. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. More details today about the industry super fund's racket that's now propping up the unions as their membership falls to less than 10% of the non-public servant workforce. Finally, the truth is getting out about how much of the superannuation system is geared to work for unions and Labor, but not for you, the worker, in your retirement. Hope that Australians might actually get some rate relief with the RBA when it meets next week, with the latest inflation data out today showing a fall. Not yet where it should be, but good news, Terry McCrann joins me. Plus, Labor's rolling of the dice with those stage 3 tax cuts, betting that voters will quickly forget their broken promise for a quick cash fix. Now, this is politics, pure and simple. More evidence confirming that today. It's all about targeting the coalition's right flank and nothing more. And after the good news yesterday, the coalition would scrap the funding for that activist environmental defender's office. It would appear they're not alone in their concerns. Nervous Labor MPs in resource-rich seats clearly understand the danger of this group.
No, but what about the EDO funding? Is that something you'll raise?
Yeah, that'll be one of the issues that I raised with the Environment Minister.
I think Luke Gosling, and he's not alone there. I've got colleagues from the Labor Party here in Tasmania who are equally worried about what the EDO is up to.
But first, despite being to blame for the mother of all broken promises, Labor's now trying to make tax a problem for Peter Dutton and the coalition. I mean, this is sheer gall. It promised, let's not forget, on some 100 separate occasions to keep those stage 3 tax cuts. Labor took that promise then to 2 elections. It actually voted for them in the parliament and was still promising to keep them until just a fortnight back. Only in spectacular fashion to renege last week, and now Labor says it wants the other side to be on the hook. Now sensibly, Peter Dutton's having none of this whatsoever.
I wasn't planning on making an announcement this week in any case. So we've got a lot of work that we've done just to look at the forward estimates numbers, the medium term and into the out years as well.
Now, notwithstanding any number of Labor ministers and media types demanding it, Dutton is steadfast in saying that it's not the coalition's job to disclose its amendments to legislation that it hasn't actually seen, that the government still hasn't actually drafted. But it does show that this whole tax ambush owes everything to tricky politics and nothing to good policy. Now, for a government that bet its house on the voice and lost, breaking its tax promise was thought to be a way for the Prime Minister to build bridges with middle-income earners and to wedge Dutton. Now, somehow, the PM's mind has reckoned the downside of the broken promise would be more than matched by the upside of watching Dutton squirm and end up increasing taxes on middle-income earners in order to reduce taxes for those on high incomes. Now, personally, I think this was all too clever by half, especially as Dutton could eventually accept Labor's changes. He hasn't broken his word after all, the PM's done that, and then still promised to restore the original tax cuts that Labor once supported but now doesn't. Now, while voters will be happy to take that extra $15 a week, this won't dull their anger over how much higher their power bills are, their mortgages, their rent is, and grocery prices are week after week. And it's all often a direct result of this government's policies that are making a bad situation worse. Now, they'll take Albanese's handout, but still vote against him on the grounds he can't be trusted anymore. Now, I still can't believe that politically he would trash his integrity for $15 a week, but he has. Now, as is so often the case in politics, those who gain, well, they won't be very grateful, but those who lose will be very resentful. And everyone will now ask themselves, does this bloke's word mean anything? Especially when it's now so obvious that the whole broken promise stunt was about wedging Dutton. Rather than improving the tax system with income tax now set to be a suffocating almost 50% of the total tax take, And with top 10% income earners, so those at the top, they're generating just below 50% of Australia's total income tax take. It's tough. Is it any wonder that serious people are tending to despair about whether our polity is now capable of the tough decisions we might need for our prosperity and security into the future? But what's the answer of the Business Council of Australia? Well, not a serious plan of their own for tax reform, not a plan that's both efficient and fair. They want a tax summit. We need a national discussion, said the head of the BCA today, on tax reform to break through the policy paralysis, with critical decisions being left in the too hard basket. Now, honestly, these guys should be ashamed of themselves, constantly demanding tough decisions, but almost never prepared to take any responsibility themselves for stating what those decisions should be and getting out and arguing for them. I mean, the BCA and all those companies, well, they could all argue for the voice, but where are they now for a better deal in taxpayers? Where are their ads for tax reform? We don't need another talk fest, certainly not on tax. What we need is leaders, political leaders especially, prepared to stand for something and see it through. Not leaders who stand for something for 5 years, only to abandon it when political convenience shifts. And look, yet again from the Albanese government, further confirmation that it thinks buckets of taxpayer money is the answer to every problem. Today, the government said it would permanently increase its funding to the state school system from 20% to 22.5% of the total. Now, that's an additional $3 billion a year forever. If, though, this is the kicker, if the states would in turn agree and guarantee their own funding to lift, so that every school would now get 100% of the so-called school resourcing standard devised by David Gonski as part of the Gillard plan to get the federal government more on the hook for state school funding. Australian schools have never been better funded. Class sizes have never been smaller. Resources never been greater. Yet our outcomes have never been poorer. Australian students fall further and further down the rankings of global attainment. Australian classrooms fall further and further down the global rankings for good student behaviour. So what's his government's response? Well, more of what's failed. And every insider knows how the game works. The feds will spend more, but the states won't. Nothing will improve. The states will then say it's all Canberra's fault, and the whole money merry-go-round will start again. Now, schools don't need more money. They need better teachers, more of an academically rigorous program, a better teaching curriculum, more parental involvement, more principal autonomy. Teachers like Britain's Catherine Burbala-Singh, they show what schools need is not more endless whinging about victimhood, but more respect for learning. Let's hope one day we'll finally have an education minister who gets it. But it's discipline, not dollars, that we most need now. I say that as a girl who went to a little country school with bugger all money at the school and a class of 6. We just need discipline and a good curriculum. All right, let's get the headlines now. Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Labor is dialling up the pressure on the coalition, seeking to force Peter Dutton and his team into backing the amended Stage 3 tax cuts when Parliament resumes next week. Beefing up its chances ahead of the Dunkley by-election,
what noise is this one making? That's an easy one, isn't it?
the Treasurer spooks Labor's tax changes.
These tax changes are better for workers and better for families.
The major parties trying to court support from Middle Australia. As the political fight ratchets up ahead of the first parliamentary sitting week of the year, Labor's crunched the numbers and found close to 85% of coalition seats stand to benefit from the tax shake-up. 5 seats held by the opposition, where 89% of taxpayers would be better off under the changes, include Ford and Longman in Queensland, Page and Cowper in New South Wales and Braddon in Tasmania.
They are standing in the way of a bigger tax cut in their own communities. This shows how diabolically out of touch the Liberals and Nationals are with Middle Australia, but also with the communities that they are supposed to be representing.
The coalition is yet to formalise its position, but for now is highlighting its own analysis that suggests Labor's changes would leave a total of 4 million Australians worse off over the decade due to bracket creep. The opposition banking on the optics of a broken election promise, cutting through with voters, drawing parallels with a backflip by a former Labor Prime Minister.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
They've been legislated. We support them. We stand by that.
Quite clearly, this was always on the agenda. His integrity is shot, and his cabinet, like lemmings, have followed their lying Prime Minister off an integrity cliff. We can never believe them again, whether they promise to not touch negative gearing, not touch taxes on the family home.
As questions are raised about whether the Stage 3 shake-up will be inflationary, the Treasurer is chalking up a lower than expected inflation rate of 4.1% to Labor's economic management.
This is not mission accomplished, but it's really welcome and it's really encouraging progress, and it shows why Labor's responsible economic management, including our cost of living tax cut for Middle Australia, has been and will be so important.
Food, housing and transport costs were still high over the December quarter, while the price of clothing is coming down. In good news for interest rates and mortgage holders, the new figures increase the chance the Reserve Bank won't need to hike the cash rate when the board meets for the first time this year next week.
Today, the Daily Telegraph revealed that industry super funds pumped close to $40 million into unions and their peak lobby group last year. More than $16 million was paid to the unions, and that's after industry regulator APRA launched an investigation into $9 million in payments the year before. That investigation, I might add, is still ongoing. Another $21.5 million went to Industry Super Australia, and it's worth noting that last financial year, unions donated almost $17 million to state and federal Labor. Former Deputy Prime Minister, former Treasurer Wayne Swan, well, he's currently the chair of Cbus Super, and former Labor Attorney General Nicola Roxon is the chair of HESTA. Now, this has got the stink of a racket, and it's all at your expense. Let's see what our panel has to say on this and all the other big headlines of the day. Sky News senior reporter Carolyn Marcus and senior fellow at the Menzies Research Centre, columnist, of course, for The Australian, Nick Cater. Well, Nick, we discussed this last night in terms of concerns that I have, and plenty of experts too, at the appointment of former union leader Greg Combay as the new chair of the Future Fund. And given this evidence today in the telly, I reckon those concerns are legitimate.
Absolutely, Peter. I mean, both the Future Fund and Superannuation funds are designed really for one thing, and that's to keep people's superannuation safe for retirement. In the case of the Future Fund, of course, is the public service. So to have any other aim other than to maximise returns for the people whose money it actually is to my mind appalling and just should not go ahead. But of course, with Labor, as you see, they've stacked the union people and former politicians on both now the Future Fund and the superannuation boards, and they're playing it for their own gain. And as you rightly said yesterday, the unions would be pretty much broke if they had to rely on membership. You know, this has been a long time in setting up this system, which goes right back to Hawke and Keating, which gives them this flow of money to them, that keeps them alive and ultimately flows through to the Labor Party. So it's the biggest vested interest in the country. Yeah, and it's a scam. And we're all starting to wake up to it. I mean, I know insiders knew about this a long time ago, but so many the Liberal Party didn't do much to halt it. They've got to tackle it now in opposition. We saw those pictures before, Carolyn. Jim Chalmers out there in Dunkley playing with kids in the sand pit. Analysis out today shows that 85%, this is Treasury analysis, 85% of taxpayers and Liberal National Party electorates are all better off under Labor's overhaul, which shows, again, this was never about the policy, it's about the politics, it's about wedging Dutton, but it's a big cost for the PM. It's $15 a week for people, but he's had to pay the price of losing his integrity. Do you think that's enough to buy the voters off?
Well, look, we are in a cost of living crisis and people are counting their dollars, every dollar at this point, but whether or not it's enough to buy off voters really remains to be seen. Dunkley will be a good test of that. I mean, in some parts of the country, $15 is enough to buy you a couple of cappuccinos with soy milk in it. So I don't know if it's going to make a whole bunch of difference to some of the higher earners among the brackets that are going to have some tax cuts. And everyone, of course, gets a tax cut, as the Prime Minister has pointed out, but not as much in some cases, obviously, as the stage 3 tax cuts that had been legislated. But, you know, Peter, obviously it is a big gamble because ultimately Mr Albanese is hoping that he can, with a little bit of short-term gain, even if it is marginal, get voters on side. The trade-off, of course, is the trust in him is completely gone. So when it comes to voting at a general election, are people going to be thinking we can trust this government and what they say on taxes and other major policies, or has this guy completely squandered our trust? And I think the answer to that has to be the latter. And even the analysis that you pointed out that the Treasury released, saying that 85% of people in Liberal and National electorates will be better off under these changes. Well, the Coalition has done its own analysis, which says actually 4 million Australians will be worse off over the next decade. So it's a case of, can we even trust their analysis on this issue?
Hey, Nick, I know you watch this pretty closely, but I'm surprised Chris Bowen puts out our new roadmap to 2050, puts it out today, but there's been the revelation. It's all been done in secret. There has been no consultation whatsoever. This is the Australian Energy Market Operator and the regulators. Now, we can't even forecast the weather this weekend pretty accurately. How on earth, particularly without consultation, are we going to be able to forecast the energy we need right out to 2050 and not end up wasting billions as we've wasted already?
Yeah, exactly, Peter. And it's just guesswork, really, in the ISP from AEMO. And it's really troubling to see that the energy regulator is sort of agreeing not to do a separate consultation on this document. They're just going to take AEMO's word for it. This is the problem with this whole thing. It's groupthink. They've got the mindset on one particular solution and they're pushing ahead with it without any viable modelling. And if Chris Bowen wants his, what does he want to make us? A green energy superpower with hydrogen by 2050, that's going to need 3 to 4 times more electricity in the grid than AEMO are forecasting. The whole thing's very, very shabby modelling. It's very shabby policy, and it needs a thorough, solid external review.
And 11, never forget, my viewers know this true, Bowen's the bloke who blew up our borders. He's also the bloke that authored that horrendous policy to scrap negative gearing. So he's still there in the cabinet. He's still pretty influential. Let's go to another big issue in Queensland, if I can, Caroline. The state wants to dump coal-fired power by 2035, so just over 10 years. They've got a renewables target of 80% of the grid. Well, as of June last year, just 26% of the state's grid came from renewables. Now you've got a whole lot of Coalition MPs up there saying this plan to dump coal is rushed. The roads and the bridges can't even handle the weight of all those wind turbines rolling into regional areas, and it's going to adversely affect agricultural land. I mean, this just goes from bad to worse, doesn't it?
And it goes from unrealistic to even more unrealistic, Peter. I mean, we're talking about 10 years away. Currently, Queensland, 74% of its energy comes from fossil fuels. They're basically wanting to legislate a complete flip of that and more, so that 80% comes from renewables. And as at least one MP there has pointed out to a parliamentary inquiry, this is going to have an enormous impact on regional communities who, in many cases, their roads and bridges aren't built to really withstand, as you mentioned, the wind turbines and the other infrastructure that's needed for these kinds of projects. It's not isolated only to Queensland, of course. This is a problem that we're seeing in so many different parts of the country. And I'll be heading to where one proposed project for a wind farm is going to be disputed by some members of the community for some of these very same reasons in New South Wales next week. So, look, it's something we're going to see more and more of across the country as the renewables race really takes pace, but it's getting a lot of people offside.
Yeah, Nick, and kudos to you. You've been writing about this now for a number of years and has really cut through. Nick Cater, thank you for that. Caroline, great to see you as always. Okay, some good news today that annual rate of inflation has dropped faster than expected in the December quarter, 5.4 down to 4.1%. It's still outside the RBA's target range of between 2 and 3%, but let's hope come next Tuesday, when the bank has its first meeting for the year, we won't see a rise in our official cash rate. Joining me now for his analysis, Herald Sun business commentator Terry McCrann. Well, good news for consumers and homeowners, fingers crossed today, but some of that retail data, Terry, was a worry. Shops are really feeling the pinch. What's your assessment from all this data out today?
Good news, bad news, Peter, out of all the data we've had. Good news, yes, inflation has fallen much faster than expected, particularly by the Reserve Bank. If it had its time over again and it could see these numbers coming, I doubt they would have hiked rates in November. It's certainly, I mean, any suggestion of any further rate hikes now is completely off the agenda. And indeed, the Reserve Bank has to start thinking about rate cuts, because the bad news is why inflation has fallen so sharply and so unexpectedly, because those high rates are working. They are hurting consumers. They are hurting home loan borrowers. Add to that all the other cost of living pressures on people generally in the community, and this is really seriously damaging the economy. We could start to see the economy turn seriously ugly over the next couple of months. It's already looking pretty ugly with those retail sales numbers. Consumer spending has cratered, and so the Reserve Bank really has to think about cutting going forward into next week and indeed into March.
What about this, well, I'll call it a PR exercise, the BCA is pushing a tax summit. I remember the Rudd tax summit, which was a stunt. It went nowhere other than into trouble. I think the mining tax and perhaps even the carbon tax was in that tax summit, and they weren't any good. And then, of course, we had the jobs summit last year, another PR stunt. Why on earth would we want another summit? Don't we just want politicians to do what they said they would do, what they legislate on tax?
Well, A, we want them to do what they said they would do, 100 times at least from the Prime Minister. But secondly, we don't need a summit. We don't need a new Ken Henry report analysis to know how to improve our tax system. I mean, the idea that we can fix the tax system for all time is a fantasy, but how to improve our tax system, and it's precisely what the government did, the opposite of what they did this week, or last week, because what we need is not to have higher tax brackets which impose bracket creep on taxpayers, are a disincentive to work or a disincentive to get better, but actually lower tax rates on the personal income tax side, lower corporate tax rates, and indeed, as we've seen time and again across the world, when you do that, you actually generate more revenue because you generate more activity, you generate more employment, you generate more profit. So the solutions are easy, but it's the will and the sort of cynical politics that we've seen over the last week which are defeating this whole process.
All right, another set of bad numbers this week for the NDIS. Forecasts that costs will blow out to around $125 billion a year by 2034. That's 3% of our GDP. It's 3 times what we spend on Medicare today. Remember, Medicare's for all of us. The NDIS is forecast to be for around 830,000 only. Plus, that number's double our defence budget. Now, around 55%, Terry, of those under 18 on the NDIS have been diagnosed with autism. National Cabinet said, yeah, it was going to do something about it. It sorted out. It would stop the cost shifting with the states. But honestly, I remember when it was created, it was supposed to cost us $14 billion a year. How does this go on?
It's staggering, Peter, isn't it? It's just utterly staggering. But where's the surprise? Whenever governments start to spend money, what they say they're going to spend on a program is always way below where they end up. And it's not just spending every year like something like the NDIS or the healthcare or whatever, but it's also the big projects. Malcolm Turnbull's big battery, Snowy 2.0, forecast to only cost $2 billion. It's now heading for $20 billion, and who knows where it will end. And with the NDIS, I would guarantee you that when we get to 2034, 35, we'll say if only it was costing $125 billion. It's going to be end up costing much more than that, because precisely the way you've identified, you suck in all these users of the system.
Right, this is pretty incredible. Down to Victoria, it cost $2.1 billion last year to operate Victoria's fire services. Now think about that. Victoria is the smallest of our mainland states, and its operating costs were more than double that of Queensland. Now Queensland's nearly 8 times the size of Victoria and a hell of a lot more remote communities. The wages bill alone, Terry, $1.1 billion. The union out there right now wants a 25% pay rise over 3 years and over $100 million in bonuses. Now, who on earth here, Terry, has got their hands in the taxpayer till?
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Dan, who wrote to power in 2014, Dan Andrews, by buying off all the public sector unions. The police, the firefighters, the teachers, everybody in the public sector. And the chickens have sort of really multiplied since then, because it's just blown out. And it's not just the money, as you know, Peter, it's not just the pay each week, it's the conditions they get, the very attractive conditions they get as well on top of that. So you need far more people working over the course of a week to deliver the service. And we've ended up now in 2024 in Victoria, where we're paying these extraordinary sums across the public sector, and we're not getting the public service out of them. I mean, it's just an appalling mess, and it's not going to get any better under the current government.
My viewers will just have seen there on screen, right across the board, the cost of fire services in Victoria, as I said, the tiniest of the mainland states, is double that and more of every other mainland state. You're right, Chairman Down is the fault there, but so too is the current government, and not fixing them either. Terry McCrann, great to have you back on the program for 2024. Thank you for your time. All right, after the break, while the rest of the Western world seems to be preparing for the challenges we face, Labor in Australia is burying its head in the sand. Plus, we've reached peak insanity. Another sports brand choosing a biological male as the face of women's sport. But in another demonstration of where the real world is on this, the consumer backlash, swift and strong. Welcome back. Still to come, fallout from the Coalition's decision to scrap taxpayer funding for the Environmental Defender's Office. And political staff in Canberra, wait for this, they're demanding a 20% pay hike from the Prime Minister, or actually from you, the taxpayer. Geez Louise. But first, let's return to that significant alarm bell rung yesterday by former Chief of Army General Peter Lay that our military is severely under-equipped at a time when our security situation around the world has never been this dire, at least in decades. Joining me now to discuss this and more, foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Well, drones, Greg, even the Houthi rebels, they've got lethal drone capability. How on earth is our military capability lagging behind these rebel terror groups?
Well, Peter, fabulous to be with you for the first time this year. Look, you know, everything Peter Lay said is true, but it's not just for the Army. There is no branch of the Australian Defence Force, neither the Air Force nor the Navy nor the Army, nor even the civilian boffins, who has access to an armed drone. We do have some of the most expensive programs in the world to procure surveillance drones, but if there is any lesson from modern warfare, it is that the cheap, the expendable, the swarming, the many are conquering the big, the expensive and the vulnerable. So the Ukrainians showed us they can sink capital Russian warships with drones worth a few $1,000 each. And in the Red Sea, the Houthis are attacking American and Allied warships with drones, and the Americans can shoot the drones down, but they use a missile which costs tens of thousands of dollars to shoot down a drone which costs hundreds of dollars. So every military in the entire world knows this, and everybody is acquiring drones except Fort Fumble in Canberra, where we don't have a single drone. I mean, I find Australian defence policy now so completely indecipherable. We have the worst, oldest, most decrepit, incompetent, impotent surface fleet we've ever had. We can't even put our 8 aged, decrepit, old-age pension Anzac frigates to sea. We don't have a single drone. Hezbollah has 200,000 missiles. We'd be lucky to have 200. We spend $50 billion a year on defence. I don't think there can be a country on God's green earth that spends its defence dollars more ineffectively than we do.
At the same time, of course, we're educating our young to hate our country, hate the uniform, hate the flag. I mean, why on earth would they put it on to fight for us down the track if that's needed? And I read all of these comments, not from fringe actors, but from former generals, current generals around the world that say, look, these threats are real. We know in the UK they're talking about training up civilians. There's discussions here about national service. I mean, it really feels like we've got our head buried in the sand.
It sure does, Peter, and we do such stupid things. We can't get recruits. You know, we're bigger than we've ever been, 27 million people, and we can't even get the same number of recruits that we've had historically. Now, one of the things that used most furnish recruits was school cadet corps. So naturally, we abolished school cadet corps. We used to get recruits from rural Australians, but rural Australians are a smaller percentage now than they've ever been before. If you really join the military, what you're saying is you're willing to put your life on the line to go to death if necessary to fight for and save your country. Yet our military recruitment advertisements now are about sort of gender equity and, self-actualisation and so forth. I mean, I do think 100%. We don't have time to canvass this now, but I do think there is a deeper civilisational crisis here. You know, Rome, in the end, without being too historical about it, was not defeated by more sophisticated armies from Persia or Greece or whatever. They were defeated by Vandals and Goths, who were just more vigorous. And I don't know now that our society is displaying the kind of self-belief which even wants to defend itself. I mean, if it was death or surrender, I don't know that we wouldn't choose surrender.
I'm very proud to say I have a close friend and her son's just enlisted in the Air Force for all the right reasons. Cares about his country, patriotic, wants to do something with his life. So I hope there are more kids out there like that. Talk to me about this issue in PNG that's exploded in relation to China, this great security risk we have now, that Chinese military, police and other things could be deployed at the behest of the PNG people, or certainly the government. But wasn't it only last year that under Albanese we paid $200 million for a security deal with PNG that he said would keep the Chinese out?
Yeah, so I'm profoundly critical of the Albanese government in defence. I've got more sympathy for them on the Pacific because the Pacific is just intractable. However, what they told us, what the Albanese government told us is, of course, bananas. The idea that the Morrison government had neglected the South Pacific and then they came in with their pro-climate change kumbaya and stitched up a whole lot of deals and the problem was solved. Every single deal the Albanese government has stitched up has basically unravelled. Even in Papua New Guinea, it was supposed to be a security treaty and then it looked as though it wouldn't be able to be ratified in the parliament, so it was downgraded to just a security agreement. But the bottom line is, all of these Pacific countries, even if they were well run, not one of them could break even. And, you know, the truth is they're wonderful people, they're great people, they make great immigrants in Australia, but they're not well-run societies. And the need is enormous. Their need for resources is huge. I saw one figure the other day. PNG has maybe 6,000 police. It needs 24,000. So how are you going to pay for that? How are you going to train it? So they're going to try to get as much money as they can from us. But China is not going to go away. China has deep strategic ambitions in the South Pacific. It wants a military base. It wants to interfere with cyber communications, telcos, all the rest of it. It wants to separate us from the United States strategically by having a presence in the Pacific. And they've got a lot of money and they're willing to pay it in ways that we're not willing to pay it. And they're going to be always coming back. Now, it's just a sad fact of reality. We're going to be paying a lot of money to the Pacific. We need to do it in a smart way. I mean, Penny Wong has been much more active than Marise Payne, so she deserves credit for that. On the other hand, the government has an insane ministerial arrangement where their Minister for the Pacific is also their Minister for Defence Industry, a junior minister with two giant portfolios and only a junior minister's staff allocation. So that's really dumb. If you're talking about paying attention, you want a minister there virtually full time. But this, whoever's in office, Labor or Liberal, this is a very big task for Australian security as far ahead as you can see.
Just can I get a line from you, Greg? I'm almost out of time, but I'm keen on your take on this ceasefire push against Israel. Netanyahu's rejecting it because I'm told, is this right, that the part of the deal is that he must withdraw troops?
Yeah, so the problem the Israelis have is, this is a terrible problem. It's a problem from hell, really. The vast majority of the Hamas tunnel network underneath Gaza is still intact. That means for all the destruction and all the death that has occurred, if the Israelis withdraw now, Hamas will be able to reconstruct their ability to strike Israel very, very quickly. So Israel has to complete this business of rooting out these tunnels. On the other hand, there's a huge domestic pressure within Israel to get the hostages back and international pressure against Israel to wind back the severity of its operations. Netanyahu keeps saying he's determined to destroy Hamas, and I think, you know, his record tells us that when he says that sort of thing, we should believe him, and I think we should support him.
I think we should definitely support him. Thank you, Greg. Welcome back to 2024. All right, let's go to my panel now. Liberal Senator for Tasmania, Claire Chandler, and her colleague, also from Tasmania too, Shadow Environment Minister, Jonathan Duniam. Well, welcome to you both. Claire, this funding boost that Labor says, $3 billion a year into education, not a dollar will improve learning outcomes. We've seen this before. It's the standards, teaching capability, curriculum, all of that needs to be increased. We've got 1 in 3 kids right now who don't meet minimum reading, writing and numeracy, but that's not what they're teaching, is it?
Well, I think that's exactly right, Peter. And we know that teachers are, whether they're being told to teach or they're choosing to teach, these sort of favoured narratives or radical ideology to children instead of the basics of reading, writing and arithmetic. And I don't think we're going to see improvement in our educational outcomes in young kids until we can move past that. But more broadly, look, I am quite sceptical of the announcement that we saw from the Albanese government today. We know that there is a national teacher shortage, and we also know that this is a government that is very big on announcements and very, very lacking in follow through. So I'll be very interested to see whether this is actually something that they can commit to in the longer term.
And can I just say something too on education funding, because so often I hear stuff in the media that is wrong. If you look per child around the country and you combine state funding and federal funding, if a child is in a government school, they get almost twice the money, close to $40,000 a year, that a kid in a private school gets. So this idea somehow that private school kids get more than government schools, no, they don't. Kids in a government school, 2 to 1 more than a private school. That's because parents are paying the other part of the equation. Jono, terrific an announcement yesterday. Nothing is going to come from you, if elected, to this Environmental Defender's Office. There's been a big pushback today from the activists, absolutely. But what about Penny Wong, Tanya Plibersek, the minister?
Yeah, well, can I say disappointing response from Tanya Plibersek. I mean, they talk a big game about bringing down power prices and making sure we have energy security and that we get manufacturing back in this country. Well, that's not going to happen if you have the EDO funded by the taxpayer to challenge every single one of these developments that are brought forward. And so the federal court handed down this ruling, and the federal court judge, Justice Charlesworth, didn't mince words, and the most scathing of judgments I think I've read in a very long time. And all Tanya Plibersek could say to the EDO was, I hope they take notice. I don't think they're going to take notice. They'll keep doing what they do now. This is why a government shouldn't be funding an organisation decked to the rafters with activists who are not interested in jobs, are not interested in economic activity and don't care about our region. So that's why Peter Dutton quite bravely made the decision that we would not fund them, much in the same way the Abbott government made this decision in 2013. It's bad policy to fund these sorts of organisations, and I tell you what, if we win, and I hope we do, that organisation is not getting a single cent from us.
Well, I think it's just not us, Claire. I think there are a lot of women out there that are sick of these sporting companies or other companies trying to flog us things, but at the same time marketing to us with transgender women, so biological men, almost going out of the way to say to us, we want you to buy from us, but we hate you as women. This is about a transgender surfer in a recent marketing campaign. And former ambassador for Rip Curl, current pro surfer Bethany Hamilton, she's weighed into the debate. She's been on Twitter and she has missed male-bodied athletes, she said, should not be competing in female sports, period. And this is a big fight now, isn't it?
Well, it absolutely is a huge fight, like you say, Peter, and this is another example of a big corporation going woke and throwing women under the bus. Bethany Hamilton is a household name, I think generally, as well as in the surfing world. She's an incredible ambassador for her sport and is one of many female athletes who have spoken up and said that there is no place for biological men in women's sport. And yet Rip Curl dropped her as an ambassador and then introduced a trans woman to be the ambassador instead. And there has been massive blowback on this. And I really do hope that it is time for these big corporates and many left-wing politicians to realise that the overwhelming majority of people do not want to see this happening. We do not want to see biological males competing in women's sports, and we don't want to see women being deplatformed when they're trying to speak out about this.
Now, Jono, many moons ago, you and I were staffers, and I read with interest this story that one of the PM's senior advisors went along to Republican Nikki Haley's rally in Iowa. He got snapped in some photographs with Haley, even was wearing a I Pick Nikki badge. He's got moved on. Now, that's interesting, part one. But interesting, part two is there's about 500 Labor staffers in Canberra, about 150 for all the other parties combined. And there's a big push on, surprise, surprise, Labor staffers and their unions. They want a 20% pay rise. Now, I tell you, that's bigger than what public servants have got. I think these guys are drinking the Canberra Kool-Aid, aren't they?
Absolutely, Peter, they are. Well, it speaks to judgment. You know, this bloke works for a notional left of centre Prime Minister, goes to a rally like that. Of course, he's going to be moved on and disciplined in some way. But this push for a pay rise, I mean, frankly, you've got the rest of Australia struggling to pay power bills, struggling to make mortgage repayments. Their answer to a cost of living crisis is to give themselves or ask for a pay rise. These are the people that are advising the Prime Minister, the Minister for Finance, the Minister for Housing, and so on and so forth. That is an astounding claim, I have to say. Now, everyone should be paid fairly, but, you know, the quantum of what's being asked for here in a cost of living crisis, and it is not money that is generated, you know, through the means of the private sector. It is taxpayers' money. So these are the people who are paying these bills that can't pay for all of their household expenses, being asked to foot the bill for these staffers. It's pretty outrageous. And I've got to say, if these are the people providing advice to the ministers who are charting the course out of our cost of living crisis, then God help us, Peter.
God help us, all right. What about Anzac Day? Claire, we've been saying, you know, they'll get Australia Day. That's their main target. They won't stop there. They'll move on to Anzac Day. We learned today there's a push on for a rock concert in Sydney's domain. Now, it's the holiest of holy days, I think, as an Australian. I think it's incredibly meaningful. But this concert was supposed to have Alex Cooper, Deep Purple, Blondie, a whole lot of others. I think Chris Minns has tried to put his foot down on here, but this is the start of the end, I reckon. This is what they're after.
Yeah, look, I think that's a good point, Peter. And I was reading the article today and looking at the news and thinking, well, come on, guys, there are 364 other days of the year that you could have put this rock concert on. You could have put it on the 24th of April or the 26th of April. Why did it have to be the 25th of April, Anzac Day, which, as you say, is an incredibly sacred day to Australians? So I think Chris Minns is probably right to have vocalised his concerns about this. And if I were the event promoters, I'd certainly be thinking twice about whether or not it should go ahead.
I tell you, if you think we're angry about Australia Day being played with, you just touch Anzac Day, you lefties, and I think the country will come after you with brickbats. Thank you both for your time, Senators. Good luck when Parliament returns next week, right after the break. Wednesday, that of course means Kel Richards. Welcome back. Joining me as he does every Wednesday, wordsmith and broadcaster Kel Richards. Well, we're going to get into some words in a moment, Kel, but we're going to have a talk about our accents, because I have to say, forgive me, Dad, my long-departed dad, my accent's probably a little bit sharper than my dad's. He had a very laid-back Australian accent, but it's nowhere near as neat and tidy as my grandparents'. But our accents don't always stay static, do they?
No, they do change, and there's been some research. Debbie Lokes of the University of Melbourne has done some research showing that famous Victorian business of confusing L and Al, so celery becomes salary, is disappearing. It's disappearing particularly among younger people in the north of the state while remaining stable in the south of the state. A small change, because that's all that happens is small changes. Felicity Cox is Professor of Linguistics at Macquarie University. She says the old divisions of accents, which used to be broad Australian, general Australian and cultivated Australian, she says that's no longer relevant.
Oh, sorry, and South Australian. And South Australian, they have their own accents.
Yes. But can I say, all of this research misses the main point. And this is the big thing to know about the Australian accent. There are actually very, very few variations. They're relatively minor. You compare our range of accents with America, Louisiana, Texas, Brooklyn, totally different. In Britain, Yorkshire, Cockney, Mancunian, Liver. So we've actually got a great similarity of voice with only relatively minor differences. And I've drawn a conclusion from that. I think our voice, our Australian voice, tells us about Australian people. We have only minor variations in our accent, and I think our Australian people are unified, just as the accent is unified. We've only got small range of variations in our values, as we have in our voices, which is why when people try to divide Australians, they always fail. Now, maybe I'm drawing too big a conclusion from the accent, but it's a socio-linguistic fact. Yeah. It's a fact. We are a unified people. We're all Aussies.
Let's get a couple of words in if we can, or phrases in this case. Touch wood. Bev wants to know, where's touch wood come from?
It's only recorded from the 1829, 1830 in children's games, but it's almost certainly been part of folklore for a lot longer than that. It goes back to the Middle Ages, when it was believed that trees were inhabited by spirits called dyads, and if you touched the tree or knocked on the tree, Americans say knock on wood, then you would get the spirit to look after you. So, a very ancient superstition.
Peter wants to know where real McCoy comes from.
There's a fabulous story about this, claiming it comes from an American boxer, the Kid McCoy, who was welterweight champion from 1998 to 1990, and he used to get into fights, defending himself as being the real McCoy. It's a lovely story. It's too good to be true, and it's not true. It turns out the original is Scottish. It was originally the real Mackay, recorded from 1856, and it's what they said about whiskey. A drop of the real Mackay, which was the slogan for a distillery company in Edinburgh from about 1870. So it was actually the real Mackay and a bit of whiskey to begin with.
And here I was thinking it had something to do with the Hatfields and McCoys, but there you go. You know it all. You're wonderful, Kel Richards. Thank you. All right, that's it for me. I'll see you tomorrow night at 6. Here's Andrew.